welcome to another podcast. Today we're going to continue with medications and we're going to have a closer look at amiodarone. Now, amiodarone is a very popular antiarrhythmic drug, one of the most common antiarrhythmic drugs used. Its indications are many. The people who created amiodarone promise that it pretty much can be used for all forms of arrhythmias. It can even be used in congestive heart failure. It's commonly used for AFib, used for the different versions of SVT, monomorphic VT, all those non-Torsades, polymorphic VTs. And obviously, especially when lining up with our use, it's used in pulseless VF and VT that fail to convert after CPR and defibrillation. Now, before we move on to looking at the intricacies of amiodarone, we'll just have a revisit on cardiac conduction. Now, if you want a full visit on cardiac conduction, then I recommend you have a look at the conduction video I did. It goes into quite significant detail on how the whole thing works. But as an overview, because we're looking at the mother of all antiarrhythmic drugs, we'll just have a look at the cardiac phases. Now, when an action potential comes in, when you're dealing with the heart, it can come in one or two ways. It can either come in through a neural impulse, generally controlled by beta stimulus, and it can also come from the automatic leakiness of the cells, especially around the SA and the AV node. Now, when the membrane voltage reaches a certain point, it opens up voltage-gated sodium channels, and that has a massive influx of sodiums, which takes us from phase 4 to phase 1. Once we're in phase 1, the membrane voltage is high enough to open up the potassium voltage channels, which causes potassium to leak out. And when potassium leaks out, we also get chloride leaking out. Because of the chloride leaking, mostly, that lowers the membrane voltage. In order to combat this during phase 2, calcium starts leaking in order to maintain that volt for a period of time. Eventually, we have enough potassium leaking out that doesn't quite meet the calcium coming in, that a lot more gates open and we get a massive outflow of potassium. And that's phase 3. And then we go back to our phase 4, which is when the membrane is at its resting potential, waiting for the next influx to raise it again. So these phases have been used to classify different cations, mostly, that move out of the cell, and it lines up with different classes of drugs. So class 1 antiarrhythmics is associated with sodium channel blockers, and there's 3 different categories of those, denoted mostly by their strength and how many sodium channels they block. Our class 4 antiarrhythmic drugs is our calcium channel blockers. Class 2 is your beta blockers, and your class 3 is your potassium channel blockers, which is mostly where our amiodarone sits. Okay. Moving on from the precursor, we'll go into pharmacokinetics. Amiodarone is quite unique in nature. It has a ridiculous half-life and can stay in the body for a long period of time. After it's administered IV, now remembering that amiodarone use is actually more commonly oral, but in our case we use it as an IV drug, its onset can be rapid as 1 minute, but it can also be delayed up to the 30-minute mark before you can start seeing the changes in the ECG. Has a relatively good bioavailability of around 35 to 65%, depending on the patient. It's incredibly protein bound. Okay? It binds to protein with strong affinity, which contributes to its very, very, very long half-life, which has an average across the literature of 56 days. It's not a typo, it's actually 56 days half-life. As far as metabolism goes, goes through general metabolism in the liver and in the intestines as well, mostly oral, as you could imagine. And it's excreted primarily by the biliary tract. As far as what it does, its pharmacodynamics, we need to think back to the classes of drugs that we just looked at. and sort of have an understanding of what it's trying to achieve when it helps with your arrhythmia problems. So because it's primarily a class 3 antiarrhythmic, which means it blocks potassium channels, we have a prolonged QT interval. That's its main function, is it prolongs QT intervals, which basically means it makes that phase 2 last longer in the cardiac cycle before it kicks into phase 3 and the potassium starts leaking back into the cell. So you get that depolarization phase, which extends the QT interval. But amiodarone is different to a lot of other class 3 antiarrhythmics in the fact that it also inhibits sodium channels. So we have a reduction in how quick the membrane reaches that maximum potential before the potassium starts leaking out. Okay, so it blocks, it's quite a weak one, but it blocks the sodium channels. It also blocks the calcium channels, which just helps extend that phase 2 or that contraction, almost like a steady state of the contraction before depolarization kicks in. So a combination of these three things allow it to be very useful in prolonging the actual QT interval. Now that is the time between polarization and repolarization on the ECG. There's even evidence out there that suggests it also has beta 2 agonist blocking functions, which means it transcends across all 4 classes of antiarrhythmic drugs. Now, things to watch out for when giving amiodarone. Obviously, the way we give it in the emergency case doesn't have a lot of adverse effects to worry about. But when it's given for a long period of time, it has a massive list of adverse effects and very common adverse effects as well. About 50% of people who take amiodarone long term will suffer from some sort of adverse effects. And when you look closer into the adverse effects, there's even evidence that says that 90% of people that take prolonged amiodarone will get microdeposits within their eyes of crystal-like formations of amiodarone. Now, only 10% of these people will actually have visual problems, so a lot of them don't actually report it. It's just what they've found in studies. Now, it has a huge problem associated with thyroid function, so it can cause both hypo or hyperthyroidism depending on the patient. It is associated with neurotoxicity, pulmonary toxicity, and obviously your cardiac toxicity, especially when it's associated with a very prolonged QT interval, making its interaction with other beta blockers, things like digoxin, something to worry about. As far as contraindications go, there's no relevant when you're in the midst of ALS. But as we move into the infusion aspect of protocols, or even prolonged use, we need to be aware that if anyone has a second or third degree heart block, they're actually contraindicated for the use of amiodarone. If someone already has a baseline prolonged QT, it's best to avoid amiodarone. And in regards to allergies to iodine, it is still written as a contraindication, but studies are being conducted to see if it's a valid contraindication or not. So as of today, it still is. So just be aware, if you're doing it in ALS and you don't know if they have an allergy, then obviously you'll administer your amiodarone. Okay, we'll finish up with a few take-home considerations for amiodarone. The main one is our protocol states that we can give amiodarone neat, and we can even push it through a normal saline or Hartmann's bag in order to administer it to the patient. Now, there are a lot of protocols out there that will say that it's not compatible with normal saline. It says it has to be given with 5% glucose. This is based on a study that was done a long time ago, which has been disproven many times in many emergency departments, but it is still written in a lot of quite authoritative based documents. And what this means is when you're working in the military and you have approval to give it neat or give it through normal saline, that's fine. But don't be surprised if you expand your portfolio and work that you may actually have to mix it with your 5% glucose. If that's the case, just do it. No harm to the patient. We know it's compatible, and just go from there. In regards to the infusion that may be ordered after someone obtains ROSC, there is a lot of different protocols out there for infusions. The ones that primarily gets used is the 15 milligrams per kilogram over 24 hours. Now, if you're in an environment that is not a hospital, ICU, places like that, then you have to know that with the way you mix this infusion up, it cannot be done via a drops per minute. Okay? You cannot use the drip factor, especially using the 20 drops per mil equipment that we generally carry. Okay? It will work out to be about 6 to 8 drops a minute, which is just not sustainable. So it needs to be done through an infuser. The way you mix it up is you mix it up with 500 mils of 5% glucose. Now, you do use 5% glucose in this case because there is evidence out there that doesn't really support amiodarone stability in other substances for that 24-hour period. Okay, now, if your patient is suffering from hypertension and you need to give more fluid, then you simply give it through a separate site. We do not use the amiodarone infusion as a bolus dose for the hypertension. Now, as you're mixing up the infusion, it's easy enough maths to figure out that one vial of 150 milligrams in 3 mils equates to 10 kilograms of weight. Now, if you're dealing with average size adults, you'll know that you're going to go through a lot of vials in order to meet the weight. So 5 vials for 50 kilos, things like that. Now, a lot of protocols out there will actually set a maximum dose for these infusions over 24 hours to 900 or maybe 1,200 milligrams, regardless of the weight. The reason for that is the toxicology profile of amiodarone associated with those higher doses and also prolonged use. So don't be surprised that you may do the maths first and then the doctor may order just a 900 milligram amiodarone infusion. As you're giving the infusion, it's very, very important, generally speaking, but in particular with amiodarone, to monitor the site for phlebitis. Okay, and also monitor the cardiac rhythm for that prolonged QT interval happening, basically. Now, in the event you do get any early signs of phlebitis, the infusion must be stopped and you need to obtain a new site. Okay, that finishes the lesson on amiodarone. I hope you got something out of it, and until next time, take care.